are talking today about the upcoming eviction crisis in America, which experts predict could lead to nearly 4 in 10 renters facing eviction. So to delve into what people are really looking at, especially low-income renters of color, and what to do about it, we are joined by former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Mayor of San Antonio, and recent candidate for Democratic Party's nomination for president, Julian Castro, and a New York Times journalist who literally just wrote the book on this, the nationally acclaimed author of Golden Gates, Exploring America's Housing Crisis, Conor Dougherty. So, Secretary, I'm really excited to start with you. There was so much talk early on in the pandemic crisis about stopping evictions and rent cancellation and how can we keep people housed and stable during this crisis. But after evictions were halted across the country, the talk turned to other crises that were unfolding, and the media cycle moved on and things shifted. So now, as some of those eviction halts are coming to an end and expiring, we've not really addressed the underlying concerns. Can you tell us a little bit about, in your vision, what the upcoming crisis looks like and what kind of disasters renters are facing across the country?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, Emily, for inviting me on to talk about this, and thanks for Conor, who I know is going to be introduced in a second. Yeah, I mean, so what we're facing in this country right now in the next coming weeks is an eviction crisis, and really this perfect storm of misery for people out there. You think about 2020, obviously the coronavirus that has left 120,000 Americans dead, more than 40 million people who have filed for unemployment benefits, 20 million that are still unemployed right now. The grappling that we're doing with the legacy of bias and discrimination in this country, and the way that that's felt for especially Black Americans and people of color more generally. And now, in the next few weeks, what we have are a lot of eviction and moratoriums, the federal one, as limited as it is, some state ones, and city moratoriums running out. We have the federal boost to unemployment benefits running out. The stimulus check, the $1,200 stimulus check that people got, is in the rearview mirror. That didn't last, won't last, can't last for several months. On top of that, we already had a housing affordability crisis before we ever hit 2020. By some estimates, to 40% of the folks out there who rent are rent burdened, meaning that they pay more than a third of their income on rent and utilities. We know that millions of Americans have missed their rent payment in June. More Americans say they're going to miss their rent payment in July. So we really do have this perfect storm that's headed our way, and there's an urgent need to address that with concrete, immediate policy solutions and tremendous investment in the short term and in the longer term to make sure that people have a safe, decent, and affordable place to live in our country. And I look forward to that conversation.
So, Conor, you just published this incredible book, Golden Gates, which does a deep dive on all sides of the unhoused crisis in the Bay Area, in San Francisco. Can you help our viewers kind of understand how we got here and also what some of the competing interests are that are intersecting to cause this problem? Conor, you're muted. We've got to unmute you.
Sorry. Thank you again for having me on. This is great. So I'm tired of calling this complex because it seems like a cop-out, but it is complex. Housing is everything, right? It's wealth, it's health, it's education. I don't think you can be prosperous in any way, shape, or form if you don't have a stable place to be. And a lot of people don't have that now. And as the secretary just said, they didn't have it in 2019 or 2018 or 2017 either. Long before the coronavirus happened, when we were supposedly in the lowest unemployment in decades, and by all accounts, a very prosperous economy. Clearly, it was not working for tons of people. I think it's something like 30 million people are in a household where they pay over half the income in rent. That's like a lot of, maybe it's not that much, but it's in that ballpark. And it's just, and so if that was how things were when things were great, supposedly, what are they like now when things are epically horrible? I think when I go back and I try to explain this in the easiest possible way, in a way that I think we all understand, we have what people have been talking about for decades, which economists call the barbell economy, which means there's at one end of the economy is people who are doing very well, and typically work in tech or finance or some kind of profession where you're using a computer. And then on the other end are people who are doing really poorly. And they're usually in a service job, which could be retail or cleaning houses, or and in a lot of ways, they're basically waiting on those people at the top end of the barbell. In the middle, the skinny rail of middle class that we all want to thicken up in some fashion or form is the middle class, the diminishing middle class. And we could go on and on for many hours, many days about how we got there. Racism, changes in the economy, changes in education, whatever. Every explanation is right. But we're here now, and our housing market does not match that reality. We have a housing market that basically serves people at the upper end of that bar, and a housing market that really doesn't serve people at the bottom end of the bar. And on top of that, the way the economy is constructed, they kind of have to be next to each other. You kind of got to, in a lot of ways, the people at the lower end of our economy are people whose jobs haven't been automated or outsourced yet, right? And they live in an economy where they are. And so this is our economy. We need to work, and it will take probably the rest of all of our lives to make that a better middle class, to make it a less unequal economy. But in the meantime, we need to, like, right now, figure out how to make the housing market work for people, who are at the lower end of that spectrum. And as I say in my book, I feel like a lot of that means we need to build more housing. It means we need more subsidies for people who can't afford housing. It means we need some kind of protections, whether they are something like rent control or something like a tax credit program. I don't want to be like, advocating for specific policies, but something that sort of says your wages do not cover housing in the economy that you are serving. We'll find some way to make that more stable. So that's kind of where we were, and that's what I was preaching in February. And I feel like if I was preaching that in February, I've got to be, something more than preaching, screaming loudly, whatever, in June.
You're allowed to scream on the show. It's okay. And when you said you don't want to, propose specific policy solutions, you're a little bit prescient, because I'm about to make the secretary do that.
We all have different jobs. It wouldn't be any problem if everyone did the same job.
Conor finds the problems, and Secretary Castro has to solve the problems. Secretary Castro, drawing on your experience, which is both local and national, having been in the cabinet, having been mayor, that's a lot of both detail and breadth of scope. And I'd love to know what, in your view, the federal government and then cities and states need to do in order to avoid the coming sort of tsunami of evictions, and avoid a massive increase in the number of people who are experienced being unhoused. I'm going to ask you to be as wonky and concrete as you feel like being. Like, no level of detail is too much. We are here for it.
Yeah, well, I think Conor described very well the challenge that we have as a country in terms of meeting the housing needs of people out there. We had a crisis before. We have an even worse crisis now. We're headed into, a crisis that we have not seen the likes of with this eviction situation. So what can we do immediately? Number one, the HEROES Act that the Democrats passed includes, I believe, about $100 billion of direct rental assistance. Making that $100 billion investment in direct rental assistance, also extending those moratoriums on evictions, making sure that we're addressing the needs of Tenants also, a lot of these landlords, many of these landlords are, basically mom and pop landlords. They own a single family home that they rent out, or duplex or fourplex. There are corporate landlords too, but how can we do this in a way that recognizes, okay, if you have somebody that has a note on the home that they're renting out, ideally your policy would address the entire spectrum of folks with the greatest urgency on people, on renters that are facing eviction. In addition to that, really longer term, what we need to do is that we need to change the way that we prioritize housing to see it as the most stabilizing force in somebody's life, and to ensure that everybody has a safe, decent, affordable place to live. What does that look like? It looks like a refundable and advanceable renter's tax credit. Just like there are tax advantages right now to people who are paying on their mortgage, there should be a tax credit for people that are renting. It looks like turning the housing choice voucher program that HUD has into essentially an entitlement program. What I proposed was that if somebody is making less than 50% of the area median income for their community, that they would be able to get a housing choice voucher. Mind you, the way that a housing choice voucher works is that you still have to pay about 30% of your income to rent. So they have skin in the game, right? But it also allows people to be able to get housing that they just can't get right now. On top of that, we need to make significant investments in creating more housing units. We proposed a $10 billion investment for 3 million more housing units over the next decade. And we need to address the fact that homelessness is going up in this country. I'm very proud that during the Obama administration, we worked to get homelessness going in the right direction, which is down, but it started to creep up again. And that's only going to become more true in the weeks and months to come. We need to provide permanent housing and also wraparound services to help stabilize individuals and get them on the right track. Those are some of the things I think that we can do. The last thing I'll say is just that I really believe that it's time in our country that we see housing as a human right. There's no reason that in the wealthiest nation on earth that somebody should be without the most basic thing other than food and water, which is a place to lay your head, a place to stay. And that's something that we should aim for, that we should not only aspire to, but that we should work in concrete terms to achieve.
Thank you for that. Thank you for going as comprehensively as I asked you to go. I want to give Conor a chance to drill down a little bit on some of these ideas, especially because, so Conor, in your book Golden Gates, you talk. I know you don't want to use the word complexity, but
I don't mind using it. I just meant
it's complicated. So you talked about the shared sort of the lived experiences. You shared the lived experiences of people who were going through this crisis, and didn't attempt to provide, one simple solution to the answer, but instead discussed the need, in fact, for multiple approaches, much like we've sort of heard. But I'd love to give you an opportunity to drill down into some of the proposals that the Secretary has put forth and ask any questions that they raise in your mind as someone who's been very steeped in these issues.
So the question I have always wanted to ask the Secretary, and probably don't have time to go into at the length that I could spend 3 hours like asking about every line item.
We have 15 minutes, sir.
Yes, no. But what I think is one of the things, so the premise of my book is that I'm just watching people trying to solve this problem in the way that makes sense for them. You follow a 15-year-old girl as she tries to protect her family from eviction. You follow this woman trying to build a political movement around building more housing and building more dense housing. You follow a suburban city manager who's trying to get his pretty exclusive community to allow for affordable apartments and getting squashed in the process. And I guess I tried not to bias. I tried to see it as, here are people working on this problem. Let's just see why this is hard. Because we don't need a list of prescriptions anymore. We need to figure out how we're going to get there, right? Okay, so I guess the question I would have for the Secretary is, we talk a lot about the federal government And of course, there's a million things the federal government do, most of them having to do with money. But whether it's fair housing or education or any of these large initiatives we hold as values as a country, it seems like they often get stymied by some local government. For instance, we passed fair housing in supposedly in 1968, but we're more segregated now than we ever were. And a lot of that, at least as I see it, as I put forth in my book, is because local governments just do everything they can to prevent it by using basically economic stratification as a proxy for race. And whether or not they ever intended it that way, that's how it shakes out. So I guess my question is, what sorts of things could the federal government do? I mean, I could think of a million, but realistically, to kind of, I know you laid out some of these in your plan when you were running for president, but to basically, for lack of a better term, steamroll that, like how can the federal government be a vehicle for better policy, not just more money? Not that the money isn't important. You're on mute.
There you go. It's a fantastic question, and you're right that there is a lot that local communities can do and have not been doing in many cases. There are communities that we see, whether it's San Francisco or New York, or more recently, a place like Seattle, that, I remember sitting when I was HUD secretary with the mayor of Seattle and him handing me this policy booklet that had 63 different policies that the city wanted to pursue to create more affordable housing opportunity. I don't know how many they did or didn't do, but my guess is that probably half of them at least are not done, right? It is hard, but they can be doing more. A lot of times communities are shut down because building more housing, creating more housing opportunity gets tied into the stigma that is associated with anytime you say the word affordable. Also, a racial element oftentimes, right? Keeping certain people out. I can't tell you how many times I sat in city council meetings where we were doing the zoning agenda as a councilman or a mayor. And I've said for years, like, it didn't matter whether people were liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat, people that you would think, that they vote Democratic all the time would come out there for a zoning hearing when people wanted to build affordable housing near them, and they would sound like the most conservative Republican that you can imagine, right? So what can we do about that? In the campaign, what I proposed was that we would tie things like community development block grant funding and home funding and other federal funds that so many communities depend on, that we would tie that to them adopting land use policies that would ease the ability to create more affordable housing. It would not completely take away the discretion that local communities have. There are legitimate concerns that people can have, whether it's some density concerns or other concerns, right? I don't think you should take away completely the voice of neighborhood residents in an area, but I do think that we need to change those land use policies to make them more facilitative of affordable housing development. A good example of that is in California. In California, over the last several years, they just went through a battle about by right zoning designations. Right? In many California cities, in the Bay Area is a good example. You had to jump through so many hoops if you're a developer just to be able to develop housing in general, whether it's affordable or not. And there was an interplay between the people that wanted more housing opportunity and labor, for instance, the labor unions, right, that saw that ability to control those policies as a check on making sure that the right labor policies were in place. So this, the political dynamics here get fascinating and interesting. You don't usually think of these types of conflicts, but they are real for politicians there. At the end of the Obama administration, the White House actually put forward a toolkit of about 20 different policies that local communities could consider that would facilitate more affordable housing development. And I think that's a starting point. I think we actually need to be more assertive and tie funding directly to that. So that would be the linchpin of what we would do.
Emily. Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, that's what I think. I totally know what you mean. I mean, one of the things I always observe is there are local communities that do have legitimate issues with projects, and they can make them better. But it's always the conversation is basically like, what can we do to stop this thing?
Yeah.
As opposed to, well, how could we actually make it better? I almost feel like you need a vehicle that's like, okay, look, this thing is happening and you can improve it. You can change it. You can, whatever the particular process is, but there's no like just roadblocking this thing. Or maybe you could roadblock that thing, but something else replaces it or whatever it is. And the last time you and I talked, you said, I forget what it is. I'm sure you have it somewhat, you've said it before, but basically the era of small, ineffective government is over, or
Yeah.
so. And what I interpreted that to mean, but I might be totally wrong, but is something like a more regional approach, something where, so we have in the Bay Area, Apple is in this little town. I mean, it's like 70,000 people, called Cupertino, which everyone now knows because it's on their iPhone, but it's not a big town. But of course it is in the middle of this massive mega region. And they set housing policy as if they're this little suburban town, but they're not a little suburban town. They're a little suburban town with millions of square feet of office space in a giant spaceship in the middle of town. And of course, people in San Francisco have to pay for that in some capacity. People in East Palo Alto, which is an economically depressed community not too far from there, but where a lot of the service employees work. Anyway, so can you tell me a little bit? So what I interpreted it to mean when you said that was a more regional approach where these little kind of fiefdoms would have to have some responsibility to the greater. Anyway, I might be wrong there, but tell me, what did you mean by the kind of era of small, ineffective government is over, and how could we have a more, I don't know, a linear process?
Yeah, well, I mean, I meant it across the board. If you look at the last 20 years, right? You look at 15 years, Hurricane Katrina, the Great Recession, and now the coronavirus pandemic. The problem in our country has not been that our government was too big, too robust to be effective. It was that it was not competent enough, not effective enough, and not robust enough in some instances to be effective. And so this idea that smaller, weaker government, this Reagan model, that's always the way to go. Well, no, actually, I think that the world has become, complex enough, and it demands, most of all, a competent government, an effective government, and a government that's robust enough to address the biggest challenges that we face. But you make a good point about when we, apply that to the local level, we absolutely have to work regionally. When I was at HUD, one of the things that we kicked off was something called the Prosperity Playbook. The Bay Area was one of 5 regions that we included in the Prosperity Playbook. And the idea there was, hey, look, first of all, oftentimes the big city is the one that's expected to shoulder all of the burden of providing affordable housing. These suburbs don't think of themselves as having people that even need quote unquote affordable housing, even though they do, because that's the reality now in a lot of places. Their city councils are completely uncomfortable oftentimes with even entertaining the notion of that. They're against it. So they're not shouldering their responsibility to try and create some housing opportunity, many of these suburbs. Not only that, you often have a lot of people driving out or trying to get out on the bus or, the Caltrain or BART, in that area, the Bay Area, to these places. And they're not working on connecting the dots of housing with transit, with economic employment centers. And so it gets kind of what you're describing with Apple. It's just this haphazard, everybody doing their thing. And what it adds up to in the Bay Area, as a good example, is an absolute emergency where people cannot afford to live there. They're having to move 2 hours away and commute to their job every day, or, an hour and a half. So they spend 3 hours during the day commuting. And these companies that never never thought they would be in this position are having to throw, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars, commit hundreds of millions of dollars, in the case, I think, of Google, to trying to create more affordable housing opportunity. And as noble as that is, and I applaud Facebook and Google, and I don't know if Apple is doing the same thing, for investing in more affordable housing, they should do that. Really, what this says is that we need the people, we need the government to step in and to invest more in housing opportunity at the federal level, the state level, and we need to think regionally about how housing opportunity, transit, employment, education all go together to boost up upward mobility and quality of life for everybody.
So I guess with a couple minutes left, we should swing it back to COVID. One thing we know, just to build off what you just said, one thing we know is that in these really prosperous regions where housing is a huge issue, we get a lot of overcrowding. And one of the things we also know is that overcrowding is like one of the highest risk factors for spread of coronavirus. It turns out that's much more important than density on its own, hence why Manhattan is nowhere near as bad as Queens. And in the Bay Area, you can see there's like 3 or 4 zip codes like East San Jose and East Palo Alto that have a lot of the cases, right? And then some parts of Oakland. All right, so you talked about the HEROES Act, you talked about all these different things, eviction moratoriums. One thing I've been kind of impressed by, and I do think a lot of people don't like talking about this because I feel like it is how well the $2 trillion seems to have done. I mean, it has a million problems. The PPP thing is all messed up and whatever, but a lot of the rent data, though bad, has not been nearly as bad as I thought it would be. And we, of course, published on the front page the other day that the poverty rate, it might go down. So what we've learned is like, oh, wow, like just putting a bunch of money into this problem, like totally works. And I guess what I would ask you is like, I don't know, when we think about what can we learn from that? Because I actually feel like my perception of the situation is that money turned out to be much more important than a lot of the moratoriums. Not that the moratoriums aren't important, but that like just giving people the ability to meet their bills turned out to be like the best, smartest thing we could have ever possibly done.
Yeah.
And so if you could just kind of, I don't know, engage that a little bit, because I do feel like there's a lesson in that, like, wow, it happened really quickly. It was like totally effective. You know what I mean? Like, and I just feel like it's an opportunity and a lesson for us.
Yeah, I saw that story that you're talking about, which was a fascinating story. And obviously we'll wait to see more of the research that comes out on this time period. But what's promising about this is that it provides early evidence that, hey, look, if you make the investment, it's going to make a difference in reducing that poverty level and in people's quality of life. The first thing that I thought about when I saw that was it shows that people are responsible. People are paying their rent. People are buying the groceries that they need. People are taking care of their families. There's been this notion, this caricature that's been created unfairly of people, a lot of times, especially of people of color. You remember Reagan and the welfare queen of that, oh, don't give these folks money, because if you give them money, they're going to go buy a TV, or they're going to go, waste it doing X, Y, or Z, or buying alcohol, whatever it is. It was affirming both for the individual level, because I think people are being responsible, that people understand what they need to do, what their priority is. We can trust in people. This was kind of the hurdle that some folks had to get over with housing first as a policy, that we would put people who are homeless, into no questions asked, essentially, into permanent housing, not make them jump through hoops and get over their addiction first and X, Y, and Z. If you trust in people, if you invest in them, then they respond. And going forward, what that means is that it's one more piece of persuasive evidence for policymakers of different stripes that, look, we can make these investments, we can actually make a difference in people's lives, and we can get stronger as a country because of that. It doesn't, we don't have to be stuck to our old notions of what works and what doesn't work.
Secretary Castro and Conor Dougherty, thank you so much for digging in on this. And I've been just silently really engaged by this conversation. So thank you so much for engaging with that. Thanks to our viewers for joining us in this deep dive on housing. We actually have another episode of the briefing coming up next at 4:30. We're going to be talking about what alternate forms of emergency responders might look like. So I hope you will stick around and join us for that. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza.